Morning, everyone. Absolute pleasure to be here today, to be able to speak to you about the critical role that we see innovation and, in particular, RegTech playing as part of our wider duties and our wider mission as the regulator. Just a very brief bit of sort of background. I mean, we see innovation, and I've said this many, many times, we see innovation as being absolutely critical to the role that we play around promoting competition, the duties we have in that space, and in particular, the role that disruptive innovation can play in beginning to shape markets, the way in which it causes business models to change, the way in which it begins to put customers back in focus, and the way that it begins to shake the position that incumbents can have. So anything we can do around our wider duty to promote competition, to encourage either new entrants or indeed some of the existing players to change their behaviours so that we see a more diverse, a more innovative, a more customer-focused financial services industry, then frankly the better. So we see, this really is a central part of our mission as a regulator. And innovation remains at the forefront of our agenda. It's identified in our business plan as one of the 7 key priorities for us this year, and we've set out an agenda that goes obviously beyond the current year itself. So today I wanted to use this chance to talk about 3 key things really. So first of all, what's our overall approach towards regulation for those of you who perhaps aren't familiar with it when we talk about innovation, and in particular Project Innovate, which is our flagship for leading this work. Secondly, I want to talk about RegTech, so how do we apply thinking about technology, thinking about innovation to actually the way that regulatory obligations can be met and how can that work in the world. And then finally, a little bit about our international approach. And obviously, given the title of this session, I'm going to spend most of the time talking about RegTech, and one of the things I'm delighted to be able to talk about today is the publication that we had earlier on this morning of our response to the call for inputs around what can we do as the regulator in the RegTech space. Before I go on though, there's a bit of an elephant in the room, and I think it'd be rather odd as a regulator to be standing here and not say just a very few words, obviously about the outcome of the EU referendum, given it's got such a bearing on the innovation space. So obviously the longer term impacts of the decision by the UK population to leave the EU on the overall framework between the UK and the rest of Europe and indeed the rest of the world will fundamentally depend on decisions that are going to be made by the government over the coming weeks and months ahead. And therefore, this is very much the government's lead in terms of how it thinks about the UK's future relationship with the EU. A lot of our current regulation has some sort of European route to it, and those rules, laws, requirements obviously remain applicable until such point as the government and Parliament make any decisions otherwise. So one thing that's important to stress and provides a bit of context for the rest of what I'm about to talk about is that from our perspective, and indeed from the government's perspective, it's been made very clear that we expect firms to still comply with the obligations that fall upon them under UK law, including those that are derived from European law, and also that we expect firms, and indeed government expects us as regulator, to continue to bring forward plans to implement European law as well that's still to come into effect. Similarly, consumers' rights and protections that have a basis in European law are unaffected in the short term by the result of the referendum and remain unchanged unless and until the government decides otherwise to change the applicable legislation. So clearly at the moment there are an awful lot of issues in play that the authorities, so government, particularly in our case the Treasury, the Bank of England, the FCA, others, need to be engaged in. We will obviously play our part in that. We'll be part of the technical advice that's provided to government around some of these questions, but there's nothing more that I think it's appropriate to say around the subject as a regulator at the current time. But the one thing I did absolutely want to stress is that as we work through these issues, our commitment as a regulator to both competition and innovation remains unchanged. So thinking about that commitment and what it's meant, since the launch of the FCA in 2013, we've spent a lot of time looking at how can we improve competition, how can we think about improving the way in which markets that we regulate work. Some very early work that we did was around how can we work with our colleagues in the Prudential Regulation Authority to make it easier, for example, to start a new bank. Not lower the standards, but actually how do you make it just easier to navigate that process. But our really big commitment to this space was the launch of Project Innovate back in October 2014. Financial regulation can be incredibly complex, particularly if you're trying to get into the space for the first time, particularly if your skill set may be elsewhere, particularly if it's technical. And that's why we started Project Innovate. So we wanted to support both firms that were already regulated and those that wanted to think about coming into the regulated space. How do they bring innovative ideas into financial services markets, and where do we provide some help to that process as the regulator, particularly where we think those ideas are in the interests of consumers. One point that's worth just stressing, we haven't relaxed our standards. We haven't sort of said, we're going to waive bits of the rule book or anything like that. What we're trying to do is to make it easier for firms, whether they're established players or whether they're new players, to actually begin to bring innovation into the market and to navigate the space that's there. So Project Innovate really had sort of two aims when we launched it. The first was, on the one hand, to give some direct support to individual firms and individual innovators coming into the market. And then the other, and just as importantly, to allow us as a regulator to learn from that experience, think about where our rules or our processes were actually creating barriers to innovation, and then how could we begin to amend and change them. In its first year, Project Innovate supported 177 firms. Wind the clock on another 8 months, that total is now up to 300. And I'm extremely proud. I really am incredibly proud of the people who have worked on this, but obviously we need to think about how do we do more, both in terms of what does that experience of coming into regulation feel like, but also, given this is a learning experience for us, where are the places where we need to move on the story around innovation. And one of the ways that we've been doing that through Project Innovate is the launch in May of the regulatory sandbox. The first tranche of applications, the window for that has just closed. And the design of the sandbox is to allow firms to test innovative ideas. So in other words, how can we create a controlled environment in which consumers are still protected and yet the full burden of regulation, the full panoply of requirements might not apply to those firms who are actually engaged in that test. It's clear to everyone this is an experiment, but it allows ideas potentially to come to market quicker. So we offer within the sandbox a range of new ideas, for example, a tailored authorisation process, so you only have to be authorised for the test itself. So the idea behind that is that the requirements we'll impose are much lighter potentially, that individual support for firms and testing ideas that don't fit neatly into the current regulatory framework, we can actually both learn from that experience. And then in some cases, specifically where someone is trying to experiment, it's very clear to us that consumers will be put back in the right place if that experiment doesn't work. Actually being prepared to go as far as saying, we will hold you effectively harmless in that instance in terms of there being no enforcement action, given that we all understood the terms on which that was happening. So this is quite a bold move for a regulator to undertake. We think most of what we're suggesting in the sandbox has not been tried elsewhere. We're the first in the world to do these things. And we've been really, really pleased by the response that we've had. Far more firms than I think we thought might come forward in that first tranche, so much so that we're actually going to put some more people onto this. But I think a real chance for us to take forward innovation in the market and all sorts of ideas from large firms, small firms, across every sector you can think of. and really, I think, the potential to have a really strong boost for innovation, and we're going to say some more about that in the coming weeks. But I wanted now to turn to the main sort of substance of what I wanted to talk about, which is around RegTech itself, and in particular the publication that we've made earlier today. So listening to a mixture of consumers, firms that are involved in technology, firms that are involved in financial services, academics around the subject, has been a key part of how we've tried to take forward our work on RegTech. And we sort of brought that together earlier in November when we put out a publication to say, look, these are some of the ideas we're having, these are some of the areas we're interested in, tell us what you think. And so we asked, what does the industry think about RegTech? What level of importance do firms, do consumers, do others in the space place upon it? What do they think it might do? What can we do using RegTech to think about improving the efficiency and the effectiveness of regulatory reporting and compliance? What role should we as the regulator play, including being prepared for the answer, none, get out of the way? And also, what are the views on challenges, risks, opportunities in this space? And again, is there something we can do to help navigate some of that space and maybe get rid of some of the things that might be stopping RegTech developing as a fully blown industry? So I think it's a bit of an understatement to say we're extremely pleased by the level of response. A lot of our consultations maybe get a few dozen people reply. We actually had 350 responses from a wide spectrum of people across the board. Over 60% of those responses came directly from people who are either in board level roles or very senior management roles within both sort of consumer representatives, but also largely drawn from the industry, whether they were technology providers or whether they were financial services firms. And I think in part that reflects the fact that if we just step back for a moment, billions of pounds and tens of thousands of people are currently employed in the UK and around the world in thinking about compliance, in thinking about how do you deal with things like money laundering. This is a huge sort of subset of the financial services industry that we're talking about here, that has to make sure that the space in which financial services operate is as safe as it can be. And an awful lot of the work that's being done there is incredibly important to make sure that there's a financial services system that people can trust in, that it's a safe system, and it's incredibly necessary work. But we have to keep asking ourselves, can this be done better? Can it be done more efficiently? And we need to have at the back of our minds the fact that a lot of these requirements, when you stack them up, actually can be very significant barriers to competition and new entrants coming into the market, and also the costs that we as a regulator impose into the system, that others build around it, ultimately find their way to consumers. So making sure that this works as efficiently and as simply as we possibly can whilst being effective is a real challenge for us all. So we've got a real interest in working with those involved in developing technologies to improve regulatory reporting, data sharing, those kinds of questions, and thinking about how, as a regulator, do we make our handbook, our rules more accessible. So let me just give you briefly the sort of the four main messages and the main areas that we took from the call for inputs, and really there, I think, a bit of a guide to what could this space look like in the future. I think there's also, should be no surprise, but nevertheless might be a little bit of a surprise, that many of the Fintech solutions that people are talking about governing the space between firms and consumers actually have some kind of application in thinking about the space between the regulator and the firms that we regulate. So firstly, we had a lot of responses that were around making the business of complying with reporting requirements simpler. Now that may not sound like the most interesting subject in the world, but the reality is there's a huge amount of information passing between regulators and the regulated every single day of the week, back and forth, largely coming from industry to us and then being analysed by the regulator. So can we think of solutions that might have alternative reporting mechanisms, whether there are shared utilities, whether there are online platforms? Is there scope here to make this simpler, cleaner, and easier for everybody who's involved in those processes? Secondly, where's the scope for technology to drive efficiencies in regulatory compliance? So trying to close the gap between the intention of our rules and actually what's delivered by firms on the ground. I think often that's a conversation that is disintermediated by a large number of individuals, whether they're in-house compliance people, whether they're compliance consultants, whatever they might be. And often that might add value, but also at the same time, sometimes the message that we're trying to send can be diluted on the way. So how can we see, for example, the use of things like semantic technologies, or even thinking about, is there sort of an equivalent of robo-advice in the regulatory space, help firms, particularly smaller firms, who may not be able to afford to have a large kind of compliance setup. Often the compliance setup is the corner of the chief executive's desk. How can we help them understand what our requirements are as a regulator and what their responsibilities are as a firm, and do that much more easily? Thirdly, thinking around technology that helps firms exploit their existing data for a regulatory purpose. So how do they make better decisions? How do you have better governance? And in particular, for some firms, how do you spot maybe members of your own staff who aren't actually following the rules in the way that either we or indeed the management of those firms would like them to? So how do we think about things like compliance monitoring? How do we think about trade surveillance systems and how they could work better in the future? And then finally, a whole series of comments and questions that we got back around technologies and innovations that could allow regulation and compliance processes to be delivered much more efficiently, much more cleanly, simply, and perhaps at lower cost. So here, obviously, there was a lot of interest in distributed ledger technologies. No consultation in this space is complete without at least one mention of blockchain. But also automated compliance systems. How do we think about machine-readable regulations? And how do we think about expanding the use of things like biometrics when we're looking at the identity and the verification of customers? So as well as identifying, if you like, those maybe as the sort of the four big building blocks of where we might go with this agenda in the future, the people who spoke back to us, who responded to our consultation, also identified a number of challenges and risks that we might face in this space in terms of what might be the barriers to adoption of some of these technologies and a number of other things that might get in the way. So some obviously concerned us, where, and indeed government, in terms of regulatory certainty. So where there are inconsistencies between national requirements across different territories and different regimes, how can we try and make some of that easier or simpler to navigate? How can we think about providing a bit more certainty about requirements in one country won't then suddenly be countermanded by another, which is a much bigger question about the international space. Some were worried about the complexity and the intricacy of legacy infrastructure and existing systems, particularly in the largest players within financial services. And would there really be the scope for more agile systems coming online quickly? There was also a question around risk aversion. So understandably, I think regulators globally and indeed firms often prefer to rely upon absolutely proven technologies. Now, that is completely understandable on the one hand. On the other, if we're going to make a bit of a leap here, the question is, how do we find ourselves in an environment where we can get comfortable with some of those risks? And some thought that the regulator might play a role in encouraging the take-up of those kinds of solutions. And then finally, a number of firms, particularly those at the startup end of life, just highlighted the difficulty that they face in trying to deal with the big incumbent players, not in terms of being head-to-head rivals with them, but far more actually, how do you get in there? How do you actually get the attention of larger firms? And how do you get access into an environment where you can demonstrate your ideas and potentially the benefits that you could bring when you're a minnow and they seem like a giant? In terms of our own role, the message that we heard back was pretty clear. There was a very strong interest in the regulator taking a role in this space and around these particular points. So firstly, respondents asked that we work closely with industry to help define some common standards and some guidelines around what do we mean as the regulator when we talk about RegTech. I think that's pretty reasonable. It's pretty hard not to expect us to do that. They also wanted us to increase our engagement and our collaboration, both with a new and emerging RegTech community and some traditional players. And can we use our convening power to actually bring people together and maybe make some of the conversations start to happen that are finding their way in the market, but actually are a little bit difficult at the moment within the market to make those happen. Thirdly, could we begin to provide some more steering of where are we particularly focused as a regulator? Where do we think we would like to see some solutions emerge? And I think it's reasonable, again, to expect us to give some prompts like that, but at the same time, we're not trying to dictate what this particular market should look like. And then finally, and perhaps most difficultly, respondents asked that the FCA consider playing a role in approving or certifying technology solutions that meet certain regulatory criteria. Now, that one I think is going to need quite a lot of thought. We've set that out earlier today that we think that that's going to need some quite careful reflection, because although you can see some benefits from that, there's a real danger, I think, when regulators or government begin to lock in particular standards. It's a real danger that we frankly pick the wrong one. And what we're more interested in doing in this market is actually facilitating winning answers coming forward out of the market rather than necessarily beginning to pick them ourselves. But listening to those messages and trying to think, well, what would good look like in the regulatory space? We've sort of come up with the following. This is what we want the FCA to be perceived as doing, and this is the regulator we want to be when we think about RegTech. So firstly, we want to be fully engaged with the wider Fintech community, the RegTech community, and be keen to improve the conversation that occurs between the regulator and the regulated. I think it's very easy for us to make certain assumptions, and we need to be out there and we need to be talking to people on a regular basis. We want to be seen as the regulator that encourages and supports the use of innovative technology. We want to be seen as an enabler of allowing efficient and flexible regulation and acting as a catalyst for further competition, potentially in the fintech sector. We want to be a regulator that provides an environment in which the challenges that might emerge from here, some of the risks that might emerge from here, can be identified early, and we can get on them and we can address them and manage them effectively together. We want also to recognise the importance that both the firms that we regulate and indeed a number of the technology firms that might help or supply those firms that we regulate have a good understanding of our regulatory requirements, are clear on what we might expect, rather than that coming at a nasty shock at the end of what may have been a complex development process. So we need to be clear up front where our demands are. And then finally, and most importantly, I think, is ultimately one of the things we're trying to do here is to see the benefits of this being realised for consumers. So whether that is around more efficient systems, lower costs that may flow through to consumers, or whether it's about the fact that when you go to open a bank account or you want to take out another financial services product, that can be done far more seamlessly from a consumer's point of view. We want to see how does all of this work result in benefits to the end consumer. And those should obviously be not just fine words. So I just want to spend a couple of minutes before I move on, just to talk about a couple of examples of where we've started to do this already early. So one of the things I think we recognised very, very early in this entire process was we have an ability and indeed an opportunity to bring together market participants of different sizes and different scales and really give a little nudge to probably cooperation that would occur naturally anyway, but might take a bit of time to get there, to begin to tackle some problems that matter to us from a regulatory perspective. So this led in April to us putting together what we called a tech sprint event. For those of you who don't know what a tech sprint event is, and I suspect that's probably most people in this room, because you're thinking he's just made up a word. It's sort of known, I think, to most people as a hackathon. Using the word hack didn't seem particularly good for the regulator to do, so we christened it a text print instead. But now you've got the idea of it. So what we did is, over the course of 2 days, bring together a bunch of very large existing players in the financial services market, real sort of household names that you would know and love, along with a range of fintech firms who, perhaps had not had a huge amount of conversation with some of these players before. And we said, look, we have a particular set of challenges, a particular set of issues around how particularly vulnerable people access financial services, and that's whether they're elderly, disabled, whether they've got a lack of access, possibly because they're in a rural location, or because perhaps they're financially excluded in some other way. They're sitting slightly outside the financial system. Go away, form teams together if you want, and indeed pretty much everybody did, form mixed teams. And 48 hours time, what we want to see is some working prototypes of things that might begin to improve things in this space from the point of view of the access for consumers. We had a whole host of ideas come back at us. Some of them involved things like facial and voice recognition. Some involved being able to deal with traditional financial services players, but in a multilingual way. Some were around how do you simplify the interactions and commands that you might need to give online banking to make it a much more accessible product to a whole range of people. From our perspective, the event was successful. It actually gave us quite a lot of thinking and ideas that we put into our own publications around access around a month later. But perhaps more significantly, 3 of the ideas that came out of that process are currently in commercial development. We're not playing any role in that, but the fact that we're able to sort of foster an environment in which that can begin to happen, we think is important in this space. We're planning another event like that later on this year. That's going to be focused far more around the interface between ourselves and regulated firms, so thinking far more about regulatory reporting. But we intend to have this concept of text prints as one of our tools in this space as we go forward. The other example I just wanted to talk about for a second was anti-money laundering, or AML. So that's one of our other priorities this year. I mean, within our financial crime, within our overall business plan. And we have a very, very clear objective here. We want London and the UK more generally to be a hostile environment for anyone who wants to launder money, either because they're an organised criminal gang or because it's involved in terrorist financing or whatever it might be. And I think you can't begin to touch on this subject without accepting that there's a very serious underlying purpose in what we're trying to do, and indeed we have people having to deal with some very serious individuals who might be involved in some of those practices. But I think it's also an equally important point that there can be unintended consequences of AML regulation, and that one of the things we want to do is to try and minimise the impact of that upon ordinary consumers, and that we make sure that actually this doesn't become a reason why a whole raft of people might be excluded from financial services in some way. So one of the questions is this a space in which fintech or regulatory technology can help begin to bridge some of the gap between those twin objectives of making sure that this is, on the one hand, an incredibly effective regime, and on the other hand, is one that works better for consumers. So many of the criticisms of the current AML regime are the due diligence checks that it imposes around know your customer, KYC, that they're a barrier to business, they're a barrier to innovation, and ultimately they're a barrier to competition. It's very difficult to move between your current supplier of financial services if the most effective way of proving your ID is to turn up with your driving licence and a gas bill in person at a branch. Today's regime was developed mainly in the 90s. It is worth saying that I think most of the regime is actually technology neutral. The way it's been implemented is not always technology neutral, but it does recognise there's a place in there for digital identity, for example. It doesn't have to be paper-based, but it feels very much like that today. So one of the areas that concerns us and one of the areas that we'd like to see more solutions coming forward and developed is around how do we begin to bridge some of this gap. It's worth us saying, as the regulator, we're going to be technology neutral in this space. We're not going to be in a position of recommending a particular kind of software or a particular kind of winner, or a particular kind of way of working. We don't want to be in the business of endorsing one product. But what we do want to try and see is, well, actually what will work here, and actually are there some things that we can say positively do work. So what can make it simpler, what can make it slicker, what can make it easier? We're currently at the early stages of scoping exactly what this is beginning to look like for us. We're talking to an awful lot of people, both in terms of firms that are in the regulated space, firms that might provide some of these solutions, the government and others. But to give you a sense of it, I think some of our objectives here are going to be, well, how can we streamline customer due diligence checks? How can we strengthen anti-impersonation checks? How do we share customer due diligence between parties within the financial services space? And also, how can we get better monitoring, smarter monitoring of suspicious transactions and suspicious activities that really does begin to yield a level of intelligence rather than simply trying to pick some arbitrary limits and police those. It's also worth saying, I think, that this is going to be a space that does not involve any one single party with the answer. So as I said, we're speaking very closely with the government around their Verify service and those kinds of things, but we're also speaking to a range of interesting commercial players in this space as well. So we want to see a solution come forward that probably draws on a whole range of different aspects and different players in this market. Finally, I just wanted to speak very briefly about our international activity. Fintech and RegTech are happening on a global stage. We were one of the first financial regulators in the world to put innovation and technology to be part of our agenda. And indeed, in many cases, a number of the things we've done are, we think, genuinely world first. But if we want those benefits of competition and innovation to make their way into the UK market, to see them reflected in the deal that we can get for UK consumers, then we know that we have to do whatever we can as a regulator to make sure that we can get both UK established firms to be able to grow globally, and also the best of Fintech and RegTech talent wants to come and be part of the market in the UK as well. And a simple way we can begin to do that is to make the transfer between jurisdictions as frictionless as it can be. I think one of the things we've observed in this market is people might well establish in London, but then they'll go to the next big jurisdiction where they want to expand their business overseas, and actually it feels like you've gone back to square zero again. You have to establish your bona fides with a new regulator, you have to adjust to a new regulatory system, and so on and so forth. And so what we've been doing is concluding and aiming to conclude a series of agreements internationally with other regulators where, with the firm's permission, we have the ability to pass details back and forth between us so that those bona fides can be established much quicker, the time to market can be reduced, and we can make the understanding of what does regulation look like and what do the requirements look like in each other's jurisdictions function better. It's a simple idea, but it's one already where we're seeing real firms coming across those bridges that we've established. So far, we've done that with Australia and with Singapore. I hope that we're going to have a whole series of these agreements, and I hope that I can say something very, very soon on where we're doing that next. So to conclude, Project Innovate is just under 2 years old. It is a learning experience for us. One of the things we want to do is not just think about the things that have gone well, but reflect on how can we build, innovate, how can we think about where we need to take it in the future. So we've had a good start, but it will not be the success that we want it to be unless we have a continued commitment to competition and innovation in this space, which we absolutely have. So as long as there are firms, whether they're established or whether they're new to the market, where they're bringing proposals to us and we can see benefits for consumers in the financial services market, whether that's direct or indirect, we are absolutely going to continue our role. And if we can do that right, then what we want to be ultimately able to do is to foster world-class financial technology, regulatory technology here in the UK, and to see that benefit much wider society. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for Christopher WOOLARD.